Today's episode is brought to you by HERdacity. HERdacity is a nonprofit inspiring confidence in women to achieve their professional goals. For resources, networking opportunities, and a strong community of women, visit HERdacity.org to learn more.
Welcome to HERdacious, a podcast for audacious women. Salutations to you all. Thank you for tuning in to HERdacious, the podcast for audacious women looking to up their career game a little bit and asking for a little bit of support along the way, which we here at HERdacious are happy to provide. My name's Lorelei, and I'm really excited to have a conversation today in regard to understanding, specifically how we have conversations to understand one another. And to help me understand better, I have TEDx presenter and lover of lifting heavy weights, the president and CEO of Sanders Wingo Advertising, Leslie Wingo.
Hi, how are you?
I'm excellent, Leslie. How are you?
I'm excellent as well.
Pleased to have you here today.
Thanks for having me. This should be fun.
I think it will be, because we're talking about communication, a thing of which I'm really passionate about. I think one of the things that a lot of people know about communicating in general is that we all use words and different types of body language and expression with the goal of sharing a message. Sometimes we're successful, sometimes not. When you really dive into effective communication, you know that effective communication goes one step further in that you are ensuring the successful transmission of your message to your listener. How are conversations for understanding different than what many of us would think of as having a regular conversation?
It's a really good question. I think for me, communication is definitely a two-way process with a balance of someone talking and listening. And when we get into these things, a conversation on social media is just a conversation. The likes, the e-fights, the things that go back and forth, those don't make for great conversations. So when we start talking about communicating, we have to balance listening with talking. So when we have conversations, we need to listen for understanding and not come back with a zinger of an answer, but really pay attention to what the person's saying and respond appropriately or accordingly, and not just be reactive to what they're saying. And I think that's where communication comes into play. People are very good at talking. We're not very good at listening.
Spot on. We all love to hear ourselves talk, but taking time to absorb the speaker's message can often be a little more challenging and I think time-consuming for a lot of people.
If you take a listen to a TEDx called 10 Ways to Have a Better Conversation, the speaker goes through this great example of how we can talk faster than how we can listen. And so to pay attention and focus in a world where we're completely distracted by iWatches and phones and screens and all of these different things, to actually tune in and pay attention to somebody takes some work. But when you get into that moment and truly have an honest conversation, there's nothing that can replace that.
Leslie, how did you come to this perspective shift in regard to how we communicate to understand?
The truth of the matter is, years ago, my business coach encouraged me to do a TEDx. And when I did the TEDx, I wanted to do it about my life growing up, being the only person in the room who looked like me. And to be honest, it was very much a conversation about race and sexism and all of the things that go into where we are in this moment of 2020. And to do that, I needed to give a presentation where I could speak my truth, but I also wanted people to hear what I was saying and listen to what I was saying. And so to do things and say things where people are fully engaged, I really had to think about my words so I could keep them drawn in and give me feedback, either through body language or eyes. But this, of course, was all pre-COVID, so it was in an audience.
Right.
And the other pressure of it was I knew that it was going to be published on the internet. So I wanted to appeal to the people who didn't agree with me, but who took the time, because that's that one resource you can't make more of, who took the time to listen to what I had to say. And for the most part, I think the comments have been very positive. I've, of course, gotten thumbs down, but when you can have a conversation and listen for understanding and perspective, then we can have these conversations. And I think it's important as we come up on an election, instead of it being divisive, can we sit down and actually talk and listen to one another so we can understand point of views?
How did you develop this ability to both actively communicate to understand and to share with others how to better communicate to understand?
To be honest, a lot of it was hit or miss. A lot of it was working with a business coach. A lot of it comes from practice and being repetitive in terms of what I'm doing and saying, and also trying to be empathetic to the person who is coming to the table, especially when we have difficult conversations. So to have these conversations for me and the learning of it all is how do you come to the table as you are, but also have the wherewithal to be empathetic to the person who's coming to the table as well. And some of those trainings, sometimes I do well and sometimes I fail, but I'm here to learn on how I can be better the next round. One of the pieces of training that I received, and at the time I thought it would be fun because I would be with my colleagues, it'd be great, was to take an improv class. It's by far the most terrifying thing I've ever done. But the great thing that I learned in improv is if Tina Fey and Amy Poehler make it so natural and easy, that is a skill that they have developed and crafted for years. But this ability to pay attention to who you're talking to and listen to every word they're saying gives them the room to respond appropriately. And so their venue or their topic is comedy, and so that's great. But there's a special listening communications tool that you learn in improv that allows you to be a great communicator. The other thing I learned is this idea of yes and I've heard people do it. Now that I know about it, I can hear people doing it. So instead of telling somebody, "No, you're crazy," you just listen to what they're saying and you say yes and respond to your point of view. And I think that's a really interesting way to communicate. So people, one, know that you're hearing them, but two, that you have a chance to respond and it takes the edginess out of it.
About to say, I imagine that the yes and keeps people more receptive to your response versus defensive automatically with the no, I think you're blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, the yes and is also a really critical tool when you're building ideas. And I work in a creative environment. So the yes and gives people no idea is bad. It's just an idea. And yes and you build on the idea until you come up with this idea that who would have known where the idea would have come from if somebody had been shut down by, that's a stupid idea. We're not doing that.
Yeah. In my communication background, I have experienced that women are often shut down faster than men in conversation because they've been trained to not respond. So I love the tool of yes and, which keeps the communication channels open.
And the yes and gives you room to say what you need to say in a way where people can hear it while you're talking instead of coming back with that zinger answer or defend their position because it feels like you're in agreement with them or at least you're understanding where they're coming from.
When we are communicating to understand one another, connecting with your audience is super important. So, what do we need to do to have difficult conversations that might push your listener into uncomfortable spaces?
At the end of the day, people want two things. They want to belong and they want to feel like they're okay. And if you're asking somebody to have a very complex conversation, that whole world is disrupted. For women, there's certain ways we show up. We are given labels from the time we were born. I'm a Black female. I can never change that. My son calls me mom, 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 mom. I can never change that. But then there's labels that people give us in terms of how they see us. Emotional.
Mm-hmm.
Women have been labeled aggressive. For Black women, I've been said, you're so articulate, or why are you such an angry Black woman? And so when we're coming into these conversations, there's stories put on us before we even have that conversation. And all of a sudden, that makes the conversation significantly more difficult.
What do we do?
So in these moments when we show up and we've already been disrupted because we don't feel like we're okay, we don't feel like we belong, we're having these conversations, we can start to feel our temperature rise, our blood boil. My business coach, and I'm not a scientist, but she has called this the amygdala hijack, where you start walking up this ladder of conclusions about how things are going to happen. And you're putting a lot of story and emphasis on things that none of that's happened. She would say, Leslie, you're fighting with ghosts. You're fighting with stuff that's not even there. And so once you recognize, and I can feel it now when my amygdala has been hijacked in terms of I'm going to have this conversation, it's going to be shitty, there's going to be screaming. None of that has happened yet. But if I can talk myself down from that, then I can have this more intentional, meaningful conversation without all of the emotional story to it. And all of a sudden, there's a great release because there's no longer the mental gymnastics that go along with what is going to happen.
That reminds me of a recent guest I had who suggested that we try to remain neutral in conversation and absorb the facts instead of our emotional baggage that we put with what we think we're hearing. The great phrase that I just love is to get curious, not furious.
I love that. I'm very curious about people and I like to know about people and just kind of dig in because that's where you learn about them and understand what makes them tick. And that's where relationships are built. And that's where fun starts to happen and understanding and just a different world and point of view, especially if it's from somebody who's a different culture. I mean, I have this dream that one day there will be a Chitlin and Menudo circuit where we talk about food and culture and language because people show up when they just show up differently when you can talk about all of those things. It's just fascinating to me.
As long as there's a vegetarian option on the menu, I'm there.
We'll find you a veggie option.
Thank you. We're going to take a quick minute to hijack this show for a sponsor break.
Hi, Barbie here from Moonray, husband and wife indie pop duo. If you enjoy the intro music, we invite you to listen to our debut EP, Honeymoon, streaming now on all platforms. Visit www.moonray-music.com for more.
And we're back with Leslie Wingo talking about communicating to understand. Now, Leslie, I want to dovetail off of my last question and dig a little further into difficult conversation. Let's say we're in said difficult conversation, and it might be making people a little uncomfortable. They might want to pull back. They might want to run away. They might want to ignore me. What do we do?
It's interesting to think of it this way, and it might be a little bit weird, but working with my business coach, she calls this moment a fight or flight response. And I know it sounds a little weird and crazy and off-putting, but this moment where we either run like crazy or we freeze and do nothing. And I think women are taught to be very polite and instead of responding with anger or being aggressive or emotional, we say nothing.
You just described what sounded like freeze. So women are taught to flight or freeze, and you gave the aggressive response, which is the fight, right?
Yeah. So it's either going to go down or you're going to freeze and be silent and not be in motion and not be active. That moment where your blood is boiling and I think for me, I can feel it in the back of my neck and then I can feel myself biting my teeth really tight. And when we can recognize that, then that's when everything changes. And I think the brain, if I have the story correct, because again, I'm not a scientist, the brain is imagining that there is a lion in front of you and the lion is about to attack you. So you can literally freeze and pretend like you're dead and not move or take off running. And I think we have to remember we're only having a conversation. We're simply having a conversation to see the point of view of the person we're talking to and vice versa. And if we can think of it that way, a lot of that emotional tension and I'm going to, I just want to beat somebody up, I think we lose that and we're able to stay focused in the conversation.
Okay, well, share with us some ways that we can become more cognizant of communicating to understand with others.
What works well for me is asking probing questions to understand their world or their point of view on things. One of the things that I like to ask, if I don't quite get what they're coming from, is can you tell me a little bit more about that? Or tell me what you just said, but tell me what you said differently because I don't quite understand. That way they have a chance to explain more of what they're talking about, where they're coming from. It gives me a better place of understanding so I can figure out in my own brain what's going on in their world and their point of view. And here's the thing, we may not agree, but I would rather not agree and at least understand what their world is and what they are up to.
Than having the conversation end.
Yeah, or walking away or making the assumption that they're a complete asshole and we have nothing in common. Because I do believe human beings, we do have something in common, at least at our core. That is my hope anyway.
At my core, I feel like social media has definitely perpetuated the "I think you're an asshole, so I'm gonna walk away from this conversation," like, zinger response, and that has become more and more the responsive norm for people, both online and face-to-face or virtual communication. How do we get out of this hole we're digging ourselves into unintentionally?
Yeah, I think social media does a great job of lending a voice to that, and it's easy to have a conversation, a one-way conversation, when there's no one responding to you. But the conversations that I have with people, like one-on-one conversations, and we can talk through some of the things that may be frustrating me or angering me or things that I don't understand about whatever their post was, that person is very different than the person who appears on social media.
Mm.
And that person, when I talk to them, I can really talk to them. On social media, it's just a back and forth debate on who has the biggest grind to axe and
Axe
axe
to
to
grind.
grind, axe to grind to axe, axe to grind. I totally did that like in Spanish.
I like this.
But social media, people post things on social media and there's no response to it. You can post it without responsibility.
Yeah.
You can post it without even caring about somebody else's emotion because you're just posting it. And then you have this back and forth conversation that goes nowhere. Absolutely nowhere. I've never heard anybody say, "You know what? You changed my mind with your tweet," or "You changed my mind in my opinion with your Facebook post." It doesn't work that way, I don't think.
Right? That Facebook post was so legendary. I'm changing the way I voted. All right. So give us some more tips to better communicate with the intention of understanding our fellow human beings.
When we have these conversations and we know when they're coming, we just need to recognize they're not going to be the easiest thing we've ever done. It's not going to be a 5-minute conversation where you can come in and come out and it's done and everybody feels great. So I think recognition is one. The other thing I would recommend, and I learned this through Leadership Austin, is cross your arms. Now cross your arms the other way. You can cross your arms both ways, but when you do it the other way,
That's so weird.
It's weird, it's complicated, it's a little uncomfortable, it's not natural. And I always recommend that to bring people back into conversation so they know not to fight or flight, but to stay focused. When I look back on these last 3 to 4 months in this very weird time of COVID and change, I think being in discomfort is when we learn the most about ourselves.
Yeah.
And so being uncomfortable is a good time to learn something new, get a different perspective, understand from a different point of view, and work with it. It doesn't have to feel great all of the time, but as long as we're learning, we can make a better version of ourselves.
I love that. Hear that, y'all? We can all make better versions of ourselves by leaning into some of the discomfort because that's okay. That's when we grow. Leslie, to top off this episode, give us some resources to further develop our effective communication skills.
So I like breaking things into threes. So
Okay.
behavioral economics says that people like things in threes. So not everybody learns the same way. And so the first thing I would suggest is listening to NPR's Creative Differences on Hidden Brain. He's very much a scientist, but there's just room in that to learn about how everybody's brain works and the beauty of being different. The thing I would recommend you watch is a TEDx called The Danger of the Single Story. And the danger of the single story is that you or we tell stories from one point of view when it's not necessarily our own point of view. And the last thing I would recommend is reading Why Improv Training is Business Training. When you understand how to listen, you become a much better communicator. And what you learn in improv, not only does it transfer into business, but also transfers in your personal life. When you're stuck in traffic, when you're trying to communicate with kids or people who are behaving like kids, the yes and is a very effective tool.
Love it. Thank you, Leslie.
Thank you.
And to wrap up our show, we shall do our Femme fact as we do. Leslie, have you been COVID safe shopping lately out in the store?
Grocery store, yes.
All right. You noticed any of the Halloween costumes already on display for America's favorite fall fun?
No.
Oh, gosh. Well, they're there.
Okay.
All right. So perhaps the listeners are already thinking about maybe what they want to be for Halloween, what their kids are going to dress up as. Should we be able to have an opportunity to dress up and go out and do things in general? Perhaps the dudes are thinking pirates and the gals are thinking princess or the ever-classic witch. Well, here at HERdacious, we're all about breaking some gender norms, even while in costume. For those of you who don't know, the dude version of a witch is a warlock. The dude version of a princess is a prince. So what's the lady version of a pirate?
A badass pirate?
It is actually. It's still pirate. Isn't that wonderful? Yeah, gender neutral term. So in today's Femme Fact, we're going back to the Qing Dynasty, circa early 1800s-ish, when Ching Shih's fierce band of pirates terrorized the China seas. Ching Shih, born Shi Yang, was born in Guangzhou, China in 1775. Unfortunately, little is known about Shi Yang or her family until she married a notorious pirate by the name of Zhang Yi. This is where her career in piracy, specifically the kind in boats, kicked off. Ching Shih's husband came from an extended lineage of pirates. While it is debated whether he married Ching for business purposes or infatuation, Ching Shih didn't much care because at her heart, she was a businesswoman. She figured an official consolidation was her way to a financially secured life. Through that marriage, she gained 50% control of and share over their pirate enterprise after marriage. And these sweethearts formed a pirate coalition that ended up topping 70,000 sailors, or pirates, and over 1,700 ships, all color-coded, mind you, eventually becoming known as the infamous Red Flag Fleet, the most powerful seafaring coalition in China. Zhang Yi died in 1807. Madame Ching, as she became known, quickly adopted her late husband's responsibilities and took command over the pirate coalition. She earned the trust of her lieutenants by sharing power with them, and together they collected money, raided camps, ships, river towns, villages, and ultimately gaining a ton of power and regional control. Madame Ching and her crew dodged every attempt from the government to rein them in. She was even offered amnesty for her crimes as an incentive to stop, which she ignored. To harness even more power, Madame Ching developed relationships with several rival coalitions, making her fleet essential to these other organizations' operations. Now that is the power of networking. Some of her executive orders were as follows. Madame Ching okays all attacks beforehand. You disobey, beheaded. All loot goes to your supervisor, who distributes it later. Disobey once, beaten severely. Disobey twice, beheading. You do not desert your post or take shore leave without permission. Disobey once, your ears are cut off because clearly you weren't using them. You disobey twice, beheading. Rape a female captive, beheading. Have consensual sex with a female captive without permission, beheading. If you want to have consensual sex with a female prisoner, you have to take her as your wife. You have to be faithful to her and treat her well. And if not,
beheading.
Exactly. You're picking up what I'm putting down here. They also don't say plunder. Instead, it's the transference of goods. Although Madame Ching had a successful and long career as a pirate, her later life was somewhat toned down. Madame Ching had become so powerful that she was eventually able to bargain for and secure her own retirement, getting a huge payout, a pardon for all of her crimes, and she even ended up as an advisor to the Chinese head of state during the First Opium War. Additionally, her second husband became a captain in the Chinese Navy, while the vast majority of her pirate band just laid down their weapons and were pardoned and went about their way. Madame Ching died a wealthy woman at the age of 69, surrounded by her family in Macau. So to all the ladies and little ladies out there currently pondering on a Halloween costume, consider the pirate, the most feared and democratic of seafarers. Madame Ching shows us that pirate women were tough, methodical, tactical, fiscally minded, and organized. They were negotiators, warriors, and were collaborative. Leslie, I want to thank you for this collaboration today. I think you brought a lot of wisdom and power to this conversation, and I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. It was a lot of fun. I appreciate it.
We appreciate you. And if you appreciated this podcast, please subscribe and share with a friend. You never know what pirate lass might want a little bit of HERdacious in her life. Until next time, let's all make some power moves together, whether on the high seas, in the boardroom, or around the kitchen table. You got this.